So with former WWE, TNA, WCW writer Vince Russo, every story he seems to tell, it starts with the same word, bro. Is this just an annoying gimmick? Or is this just the key to why he's one of still wrestling's most talked about, let's say, one of the most controversial figures? With Russo, he's somebody that I would very much like from maybe around, let's say, 2014 when he started to have an online presence on social media until maybe around 2020. I would very much say I was like a Vince Russo guy. I grew up on the Attitude Era, and to me, the Attitude Era, yeah, I'm going to be biased because I lived through that. This is growing up in my childhood days, but I would say that that was the best era in professional wrestling. And Vince Russo had a huge part to play in the success of the wrestling for WWE, WWF at that time. What was the Attitude Era with some might say car crash. It was very much pushing boundaries, cultural boundaries, and it was just really, really enjoyable, entertaining time in wrestling. So I was very much on board. So if Russo said something was good, I would think, yeah, definitely it's good. If Russo thought something sucked, I would think, yeah, that sucks, man. I was very much on board. I suppose I was drinking the Vince Russo Kool-Aid. But I would also always hear what people would say about Russo. There was always that criticism there, which may have been at a professional level, and there was also that criticism at a personal level as well. A lot of people say about Vince Russo that he was maybe perhaps lucky. It was the right place, right time. Vince McMahon was desperate at that time, needed a change, he gave him a chance, and he got lucky in that respect. A lot of people say that Vince McMahon was the filter for Vince Russo. And then there's a lot of people who maybe bash Russo on a personal level. There's people that maybe just find him a little bit annoying, a little bit overbearing, maybe a bit too loud. Some people might say he's a bit obnoxious. And then you get people like, Jim Cornette and Eric Bischoff who just flat out have this huge disdain for him. I certainly don't have any disdain towards Vince Russo. I think he's actually quite a good guy at his core. I believe Kevin Nash has said this before. He's probably somebody who's misunderstood. But I think sometimes with Russo, he maybe brings some of this on himself. Maybe there's some drama. Maybe sometimes he just feels the need to kind of have a go and criticize things when he doesn't really have to. So sometimes Vince Russo brings this stuff on. I think he brings it on sometimes himself. But then sometimes he wants to kind of maybe, play the victim and say, oh, why are these people attacking me? It's all fine and dandy for Vince Russo to attack people and really mock and ridicule people when he does his Castrating the Mark show. But when any time they bite back and criticize him, it's like, oh no, that can't be happening. So there is that, maybe a little bit of that double standard there, or, a bit of hypocrisy, what some might say. But there's certain things that I've pointed, and I don't forget things, and I can remember certain things that Russo would say. And if you're a huge Russo fan, maybe you can overlook them. But then again, if you're somebody that wants to learn more and have an understanding and not just believe everything that every one person says in life and just fully 100% buy into someone else's worldview without asking any questions, like, you want to have that willingness to learn, and you want to be like, well, because I did used to buy into a lot of things that Russo said, maybe not everything he says is spot on about, certainly about, the product, whether it was, 15, 20 years ago or the product today. There's definitely inconsistencies there with Russo, and I think when I started to notice them, I think it was around 2020 time. I remember Russo being critical of AEW, and one of the criticisms he had was he was saying that, it was almost like I think what he was saying was like the baby faces were acting like heels. And he was kind of complaining that, heels aren't acting like heels and baby faces aren't acting like baby faces. But very early on to following Vince Russo always used to say, he used to be critical of like the typical, baby face heel dynamic. So, if a heel's in a confrontation with a baby face, what would the bad guy do? The bad guy shows fear. He's afraid. He runs away. That's a valid criticism in fairness, but Vince Russo has always said, like, I think he even maybe said this. Apparently, he said this to Dutch Mantel in TNA. They were both writers. He maybe came out of a writers' meeting one day, a production meeting, or whatever, and he said to Dutch, the heel and babyface thing, I don't get it. So Vince Russo is basically saying that he doesn't understand why babyfaces have to act like a certain way and heels have to act like a certain way. Like he said this before, there's all shades of grey. So then why would Vince Russo need to criticize about how maybe a babyface and on the AEW show did something a little bit heelish? So that I never understood. And it was around that time as well where Russo was like, personally, it was like he was shown to be a little bit kind of maybe, I don't want to say bad, but it was like with the whole thing when he brings in Billy Batty, and I don't think he was entirely being honest with his audience as to why he brought in Billy Batty. Maybe Billy Batty told him, put him over like $1 million because he was a mark for Russo for, what he did naturally there. Billy may have told Russo what he wanted to hear. But then I think there might have been something more to that, because it might have been, Billy's Batty's big into sports betting and gambling, so maybe there was like some deal there where he was getting some good tips on bets and stuff like that. But again, it was this thing with Billy Batty, and it was very, Billy Batty was some of the racist and homophobic jokes and stuff he was saying, and stuff where he's, said some really horrible, offensive things to other wrestling talent on social media, and that was documented in the past. And when this was brought to Russo's attention, he always ignored people, he muted people, he blocked people about this. Jeff Lane was the same, he muted people, he blocked people on this when people tried to raise awareness. And then I think a year or so later, they had some falling out, Billy and Russo did, and that was maybe kind of it. Russo was kind of done with Billy Batty, or no longer had him on his brand. Russo's the brand. And then Billy Batty goes to Keeping It 100 and didn't get along with the guys there. They tolerated him, and then he kept just pushing his luck and then pissed them off. And again, it was biting. He always does bite the hand that feeds him, does Billy. So they learned the hard way as well. So there was that kind of thing. It says a lot about the character, the company you keep. And I think that was a little bit disappointing on the side when it comes to Vince hanging around Billy Batty and being associated with him. I think it wouldn't do well for his reputation in the long run. So there's always some inconsistencies with stories that Russo tells. I mean, the Bash at the Beach incident, like when I hear Russo's story, I can kind of like buy into almost like 98% of what Russo says. The only thing where Russo loses me is where Russo claims that, it was all fine and dandy with Hogan and Bischoff, what the deal was, and they were in on it. They were in on the whole thing about the finger poke of doom, or whatever it was, Jarrett laying down for Hogan. They were in on the whole thing. It was going to be Jarrett and Booker in the main event once they left the building. But then the whole thing, it totally changed when Hogan goes on the internet. And everyone's saying, oh, Russo finally put Hogan in his place. He stuck 2 fingers up to Hogan. That kind of thing. But I still find it hard to believe that like a 46, 47-year-old man at the time, like Hulk Hogan, and this is 2000. This is not like when everybody's like internet tech savvy. A 46-year-old man at that time who probably didn't even know how to turn on a computer, who's like one of the most famous people in the world, a multi-millionaire, he's going on the internet and he's caring what internet fans say. I have a hard time believing that. So there's certain parts of that story I'm not sure I buy. Now there's a thing with TNA, there's a whole thing, did Eric Bischoff make Vince Russo cry? I don't know if he made him cry, but then Bischoff now is, maybe it was a few months ago in his podcast with Conrad, had said that something, it was like, there was a meeting and, I think it was Matt Conway, a guy who was neutral, who was a writer, but I think he was kind of like meant to be a spy for Dixie also. He basically got asked, what happened here in this situation, like an issue with Vince and Eric. Matt Conway says, Vince, Eric's right. And then apparently he starts breaking down in tears. I'm sorry. I don't know if that's strictly true. Maybe he was a bit emotional. His voices were raised. I have a hard time believing that Eric Bischoff would have made Vince Russo cry. Like he had that power to make a guy that would have been like 50 years old cry. I don't know about that. One story that I find, this is where Russo, I think his ego gets the best of him, because there's the whole story about Vince Russo that apparently was going to come back and be the head writer of WWE. This is like he was brought in at King of the Ring 2002. Now, the story that Russo tells was that, it was the people like Paul Heyman and Michael Hayes that were the ones that were burying him behind his back to Vince, and then which led to Vince deciding, no, I'm not gonna have you. I'm gonna decide not to have you do the gig now as the head writer, and I think he was maybe a consultant for a couple of weeks. Now that is possible, but then I feel like, I don't know how Vince McMahon fully worked. Would have he brought Russo in without telling anybody? Would have that been his style, to not tell anyone and inform anyone? Maybe so. But then, I don't know, maybe he would have told people. I don't know. But the thing that, I remember Jeff Lane bringing this to Russo's attention is that Vince McMahon, part of the reason he didn't carry what it was with Vince, he was unimpressed by Russo because Russo hadn't done his homework on what had been happening previously in WWE programming. He didn't know that Chris Jericho and Triple H had worked together. They had wrestled in the main event of Mania 18, and then they had a Hell in a Cell match on Judgment Day 2 months later. And so then Russo must have thought, oh, well, let's do a program. Let's have Jericho and Triple H work. So that annoyed Vince. And that's understandable. But that's something that Vince Russo doesn't want to believe. And Vince Russo's ego was big at the time, and he admits, I didn't give a shit. I didn't want to care about watching Triple H and Chris Jericho. But maybe if you don't care, Vince, at the same time, maybe you want to do your homework, so when you're coming back and you're putting your spin on things, that it's not just stuff that people saw, 3-4 months ago. So then your shit is better. So then that was a part where I think Vince Russo's ego got the best of him, and maybe he doesn't want to admit it. The stuff with, Disco Inferno, Glenn Gilberti, I don't know what's going on there. Vince Russo apparently has kicked him off his show. Lines, was it, or timeout, or whatever it's called. I don't know what it was. I felt maybe it was shtick initially, but I feel like Disco, I don't know what it is with Disco. Maybe Disco just doesn't, actually see Russo as a friend, and he just enjoys taking digs at him. I don't know what the deal is there with these guys. But one thing I would agree with Disco is, with Glenn, is that, Russo's whole shtick has been for 20 years, if I didn't write it, it sucks. Russo has even said before, like when he left in 99 and the product was still fairly hot, after he left and then going into year 2000. Russo has said this before, that basically the product was only good based off the back of what he had done. So it was like he couldn't even give any credit to the guys that were putting all that work in and writing on the show at that time. So that's the thing with Russo. There's a bit of shtick there. And then Russo, I don't know, there was the whole thing of, Russo maybe apparently went to Destination America with TNA, and they played his part of them getting kicked off of that because he basically phoned them up and said, hey, you've been sold a bill of goods on this. Apparently, he had done something similar with USA Network with Raw a few years ago. Hey, you've been sold a bill of goods by the WWE. Supposedly, he was working as a consultant with USA, him, Ben Hameen, and Stevie Richards. So I don't know if these things are kind of like, there's a bit of an agenda there. Out of spite, he takes his shtick, and he's quite, because, he feels maybe offended that WWE haven't given him a call. They haven't offered to bring him back. I don't know. But yeah, man, I don't know. A lot of the times I do feel it's shtick with Vince. Definitely to me, he has value. He'd have value. Bring him into WWE tomorrow. And I think if you had him as a consultant or a writer, the show would improve. But there is sometimes where it's a lot of bit of shtick with Russo. There's maybe a bit, sometimes he has ulterior motives, a slight bit of an agenda. And maybe other times it's just a case that Vince Russo is very much his own worst enemy. But that's my thoughts on that, guys, with Vince Russo. But feel free to leave a comment, hit the subscribe button, and let me know. Let me know your thoughts. What do you think of Vince Russo? Are you a Vince Russo guy? Are you not someone who's a fan of Vince Russo? But give me your comment and your take on what your thoughts are on the man, the myth, Vince Russo. But that's me for now, guys. Thank you very much. Cheers. Bye.